Hello, BSides. My name is Nir. I am Principal Solutions Engineer. If you listen to what I say and implement this in your work every day, you will get promoted and a raise, and at work will always be praised. Okay, maybe the last line is a lie. Don't take it too seriously, you guys. But at least you learn a thing or two. So let's start talking. Me and you. A little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Israel. Started my career in the Israeli Intelligence Corps as a threat analyst. I graduated from the Technion as a network engineer and worked for multiple vendors, insider threats, identity management, and firewall management in the US since 2002, uh, talking in multiple B-sides. Today I'm going to talk about three main domains: threat, identity, and enforcement. So what do you think threat is? Do you think threat is a malware? A lot of people think malware is a threat or vulnerability is a threat. Threat actually has three main components: capability, opportunity, and intent. Capability could be a malware, opportunity could be a vulnerability, intent could be motivation. What is identity? Can identity be linked to something which is not a person? Yes, not all identities in our domain are necessarily a human being. Being the same with something described or asserted, that's the best dictionary definition I could find for identity. But in reality, identities within network security are often used or related to systems like FIMs, Federated Identity Management Services, Identity as Services, and single sign-ons, Active Directory, and other directories. There are three main ways to prove your identity or authenticate. The first is provide something you know, like a password. The second is provide something you have, like a smart card. And the last is to provide something you are, like your fingerprints. So we spoke about identity, we spoke about threat. Now enforcement. Enforcement is a lot of times associated with network access control, which is true. But in general, any implementation of policy that describes how to secure access to the network nodes or to the specific endpoints by specific users is under enforcement. There are multiple ways to implement enforcement. The usual suspects will be firewalls, intrusion prevention services, and access control solutions. Now, a lot of the analytics around identities and threat are very close to the context. The context around identities, depending whether we're looking at external or internal threat, could be threat actors, their information related to the techniques and procedures often comes in a threat intelligence feed, malware analysis, or other indicators of compromise, and geolocation. And I would add also geopolitical, uh, sometimes geopolitical conditions. For internal threats, looking at the context could be related to the employees, the connections between them and service accounts or other information, the professional information, including their day-to-day job, their title, the departments they work for, and other personal information relates to how long they've been in the company, where do they live, and so on. Another context that can help with identity and threat is behavior. Behavioral information could be used based on baseline and compared with past behavior, or could be compared with peer groups. So users with similar title, similar location, as well as TTPs, tactic, techniques, and procedures. Another context related to behavior could be the consistency of that specific behavior, whether that behavior is continuous, always, sometimes, or never. So we end up with those three domains: the identity, the enforcement, and the threat, and those tools. But the reality is that those domains are separated. And so they created a silo or security gap that either prevent detection or, in the best case, slow the process of detection and tying them all together, which end up with a long dwell time. So this is a typical scenario where an identity is stolen as a result of a compromise. User privileged escalation can end up with a threat to the organization. Lateral movement of that stolen identity and additional escalations will end up with reaching a target with no enforcement, or enforcement will be done as a result of investigation. And by the time you get into enforcement, there's a long dwell time. It might be too late. And so if we look at that specific part of the kill chain that focuses on moving laterally, escalating privilege, performing reconnaissance, internal reconnaissance, and repeating this process, we can start to understand how we can own a domain by searching the right identity. So start with a demo done by the Windows 10 version, or on the Windows 10 version, that supposedly will not allow loading kernel mode drivers. But it looks like within memory, Mimikat by Benjamin Delpy has a model that allows to load the Mimi DRV, the service. And so the point is Microsoft still makes it easy. And that helps with gaining system control. Other ways to gain system controls or other vulnerabilities could be taking over the Win32K sys driver, finding auto-elevated programs and hijacking them by adding another DLL to be loaded while running the program. A lot of them are having a path for a default DLL that not necessarily there and not necessarily relevant for the application, but can be loaded. Or injecting malware into executables, such as cmd.exe. And all of those will help with moving into the next step, including dumping credentials. Now, dumping credentials used to be easy before Windows 10, and NTLM and Kerberos secrets were part of memory, but Windows introduced credentials guard on 2016 servers and Win 10, which makes it a little bit harder for the attackers. That's a good move by isolating in memory the specific secrets that cannot be accessed by the user's session. But there is a workaround for that as well. The secret is that eventually those hashes need to get out of memory in order to authenticate with Active Directory. Now, privileges users and other users are still keeping their tickets, their Kerberos tickets within memory and can be dumped using specific Mimikatz commands. There is the eKeys command that lists the Kerberos encryption keys. And there is the logon passwords. This usually shows recently logged on users and computer credentials. The memSSP inject a malicious Windows SSP security support provider to log locally authenticated credentials. After the user has performed the logon, Mimikatz now SSP log all the information in a clear text under System32. And so the difference between 2012 or Windows 7 and 2010 and Windows 10, Windows 10 or 2016 is just a matter of whether we can dump it directly off memory or we need to wait for the user to authenticate and then we can pull the clear text. Either way, we can move to the next step, which is internal recon. Internal recon is where we're starting to look for different ways to our targets. There are many tools out there for that. Bloodhound is one of them. And the way it works is it enumerates all the accounts, endpoints, and services from Active Directory and creates a nice graph theory to automate understanding the relationship. And then you can import the results into Bloodhound user interface. And in this case, you can see the path between the initial compromise host to the target. And there are different hops on the way where the user can escalate or changed accordingly in order to eventually end up with the target machine. Other ways or other techniques for recon include brute force attacks, either depending on the password or account lock setup, either using multiple passwords on single machines or single passwords on multiple machines. Enumerating services using LDAP and RPC, and looking at account activities, finding stale accounts, or sometimes manually adding permissions to accounts, as well as leveraging accounts that are not administrators to reset administrator passwords or steal hashes or any way other than using the account directly gain the access. So now that we know which computers within the environment are accessible and we found our target, we can start moving laterally. And lateral movement can be done also with a lot of tools. Mimikatz has multiple models that allow computers to be accessed after gaining the hash or the Kerberos ticket. An interesting fact is that pass the hash can work in some cases even for passwordless solutions like smart card. This is what you can see here, because Microsoft allows keeping the smart card authentication hash to be NTLM or RC4. Other lateral movement techniques. We mentioned pass the hash can be executed with Mimikatz and PSXSec. We have pass the ticket. Can use remote desktop protocols for moving laterally. And you can use file share related protocols like SMB or FIBS. So why this movement laterally? Why is it happening? Why is it so hard to protect your network? Well, there are inherent design flows and the protocols that Microsoft offers for authentication, starting with NTLM. NTLM allows credentials exposure in memory, whether it's protected more or less, it's still there. And by the way, you just need to steal it from one machine. How many here have at least one Windows 7 in their environment? Or maybe 2008 server, maybe a 2003 server. That's enough. So we cannot really patch backwards those fixes. NTLM version 1 is a weak protocol. Like I mentioned, you cannot patch a design flow. And we just need the hashes in order to do that. So NTLM relays are possible because there's no mutual authentications. And once you crack a password, you can use it. And again, no backport of credentials card to Windows 7. Credentials card is built on Hyper-V. and NTLM enabled by default on all Win systems. Now, Kerberos is a better protocol than NTLM, but there are still some inherited flaws in it. Kerberos principals can use NTLM hashes as long-term secret keys. KerbTGT is a master key for Kerberos tickets. If you get a hold of KerbTGT, you have access to the entire kingdom. Yeah. TGT tickets are portable. So, in other words, you can move them from machine to machine. Privileged attribute certificate is not always inspected by the domain controller. For optimization purposes, Microsoft is doing that, which allows attacks like forged pack. And Kerberosing, the request for TGS ticket for cracking purposes. Kerberosing, asking TGSs, and then trying to crack the ticket. And just like in NTLM, you cannot backport patches that related to some of those vulnerabilities. So the reality is that we have very typical progress of attacks where they're starting with a low level of user space and by locally escalating to a system or local admin, running recon, trying to find a domain user, and with the domain user moving in a repeatable manner until they end up with the domain controller. Now, the domain controller is not necessarily the target, but it's an enabler for the users to reach their targets. Speaking of password hacking, you will be amazed, or maybe not be amazed, depending on how you are familiar with your users and their password, is how many are still using simple passwords related to the company's name or the school district, those kind of things. How many are repeatable? How many are used in known attacks? And so all of those can help cracking or hacking passwords. Security questions that can be answered by simple social engineering and password reset that some of the applications have the vulnerability to allow hackers to enforce. So specific tools, Brutus, Rainbow Crack, WeVAS. Oh, so some of the password cracking tools out there. Anyone uses any of those tools here? Which one do you use? Which one do you use? Great. Now, from a privilege escalations perspective, you can have multiple techniques, and the MITRE attack framework enumerate them as well. But obviously, stored credentials is an easy way. Windows kernel exploit, we mentioned it earlier. DLL injection, like I showed you. Insecure folder permissions. Many cases, we're not restricting enough. The folder permissions, we're giving much more access to users than they really need to for their daily job. And similarly, insecure service permissions. A lot of these service accounts getting an administrator level. The vendor is saying, in order for me to monitor that, I need specific capabilities, and a lot of time you can do the same work with much less permissions. And again, DLL hijacking and group policy preferences. That's a big one. Group policy preferences sometimes really help with that. And token manipulation. So again, some of the tools. Um, Again, my experience is mostly with Mimikatz, but there are other tools that can help carry those attacks. So the best way to discover services in an Active Directory environment is through what I call SPN scanning. The primary benefit of SPN scanning for an attacker over network port scanning is that SPN scanning does not require connections to every IP on the network to check service ports. SPN scanning performs service discovery via LDAP queries to a domain controller. Since SPN queries are part of normal Kerberos ticket behavior, it is difficult, if not impossible, to detect. While network port scanning is pretty obvious, service principal names, SPNs, are required to discovery of services that leverage Kerberos authentications. Speaking of Kerberos, a little short overview of how Kerberos works. So Kerberos has a two-step of two main phases. One is requesting TGT, T, which starts with, which stands for ticket granted ticket, and then the TGS, which stands for ticket granting service. So the TGT is basically a ticket that helps a user identify itself in front of Active Directory. And the TGS is request for a specific service. For example, service like printer or accessing a database, accessing a file server, and so on. The service that is getting access to providing a pack validation. A pack validation is optional. It's not always happening. And this is where the some of the attacks are leveraging the modification of pack, creating basically more um, services than originally was requested. So the TGT is encrypted, signed, delivered to the user. Only the Kerberos services and domain can open and read the TGT data. And the user presents the TGT to a DC when requesting the TGS. The DC opens the TGT plus validate the pack checksum. If the DC can open the ticket and the checksum checks out, then the data is effectively copied and created the TGS ticket. So we see that there's a lot of activities around authentication. The problem is that there's not really track of those specific protocols today. And so the attack surface that we're looking here, the authentication, specifically the network authentication attack surface, is usually part of an aggregated attack surface. So there are log files that are being collected or some other indications that are being collected and together aggregated into usually a SIEM or another monitoring system. But in order to identify a real attack, it takes a lot of time and there's not really enforcement. It's basically just enough security. There's no network controls, there's no block attacks. That's the enforcement part. So the idea behind it is to create adaptive enforcement, which means to look at what we can monitor, but also potentially block or verify before allowing. That's where the enforcement is coming into play. Now, the enforcement, when I say adaptive enforcement, I mean the enforcement could be scale or set of tools depending on the severity or the risk of the action. So with a low risk, a enforcement could be an email notification or an enforcement of password change. In a medium level of risk, you might want to have multi-factor authentication. And then in a high level of risk, you might decide you want to block the entire activity. So example of adaptive enforcement could be simply running a check of the from the specific from a specific access to a server, and depending on the user risk level, either allow access immediately or challenge the user with an MFA. For example, you can see here that user is being challenged, and then only when the user um, verify their identity, the access will be provided. So when we talk about multi-factor authentications, we can look at authentications such as passcode, which shouldn't be confused with a password. It's totally different type of authentications. One is in numeric only, the other one is full characters. A challenge response, which we spoke about, which is pretty common. Then some physical evidence or magnetic stripe key cards or fobs. And then biometrics, your eye, footprint, your fingerprint, etc. And so there are MFA solutions there that support some or if not all those, and it's definitely an enforcement that should be considered. The challenge with those enforcements is that a lot of them are not adaptive. In other words, they are binary. They're either yes or no. There's basically really pushback from users, especially within the organization, to use MFA solution for every access. And if the access becomes a user activity that is normal, not all MFA systems can adapt to it or use some kind of machine learning. So machine learning is something that can be achieved by looking at behavior. For example, if you have behavior based on logs or traffic, you can start to create a risk score, monitor all the endpoints and users, privileged users, and eventually uh, create a full visibility of identity across platforms and applications, and supporting multiple directories, Active Directory, Oracle, um, LDAP, uh, Radius, what have you. And then once you get all the information, you can start applying machine learning algorithms. So some of the machine learning algorithms that are relevant for user behavior analytics are here. And I know there are a lot of vendors out there that sell us those snake oils and call this machine learning or use it as a term without really supporting it. But um, there are specific vendors that really have that solution and can prove it. And machine learning does work, providing you have a very specific uh, question that you're trying to answer and you have an accurate data. One of the things relating to accurate data is also having it timely. Um, and that's where um, traffic might be more reliable than log files and have a little bit more information in order to provide the relevant data that machine learning needs in order to perform well. And then we can start looking at machine learning supervised and unsupervised activities. Supervised activities could be also helping with classification, looking at specific level of endpoints of identities. Um, so identity classification. What am I trying to look at? Oh, when we look at the machine learning, we need to get also into consideration the fact that identities are coming in from different devices. So identity verification from mobile and identity verification on a cloud. So there's different technologies um, to make sure that there is an IDP. The mobile applications are mixed of applications developed using HTML5, implementing SAML, Flow, SAML. Um, you basically make sure that the IDP, the identity principal, redirects to the web, login screen. Um, the idea here is to leverage SAML, Security Assertion Markup Language, which is the standard protocol for web browser single sign-on. Using secure tokens, SAML completely eliminates all passwords and instead uses standard cryptography and digital signatures to pass a secure sign-in token from an identity provider to a SaaS application. If you are an IT administrator, SAML can help you securely eliminate passwords and deploy applications much faster. If you're an application vendor, SAML can help you secure your application, reduce deployment cost, and reach greater and faster adoption. Seamless SSO can be combined with either password hash synchronization or pass-through authentication sign-in method. Seamless SSO is not applicable to Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS. So this is just one example of Cloud SSO. So gaining all the information can help with a unified visibility on users' activities. And leveraging history and peer group behavior can start helping introducing risk score to that unified visibility across mobiles and clouds. The cons with UBA is that it's really depending today on CMN logs, and it still creates a lag fatigue. There's a lot of false positives. And it is post-effect analysis. It doesn't involve real-time enforcement, אלא but rather post-mortem type of activity. And it's hard to catch privileged users misuse there because a lot of time the identity doesn't have the context around all their privileges across the cloud and mobile applications. And speaking of privilege misuse attack vectors, we can see this is from 2016, but it's still relevant. A lot of the attack still really focuses on the identities that have high privileges. So sometimes the question is whether we should focus on all users, or maybe it's better just to look at the high privileged users' activities. Now, there's a lot of places to look at. When we look at Active Directory, it's not that simple to decide which user is high privilege and which not, because all of those loopholes, I would call them. For example, you can have a regular user that has unconstrained delegation. So this account can delegate a privileged user. Um, you have settings in GPO that allows domains, allows endpoints across the domain to have the same password or the same settings for local admins. You have admin SD holder, which is supposed to protect the privileged users that can be disabled. And there's other type of privileged uh, so we're talking about many type of ways to bypass or to hide behind privileged users. So speaking of privileged users, PAM solutions are all about privileged accesses, and they're really good with password vaults, password recycling, session playback. But they are not easy to deploy, and they're only looking at privileged users. And they, once you get a hold of the passwords, you're not necessarily easy to um, to find the usage of stolen passwords. They're good with protecting the passwords, but that's going to be useless when the password are already stolen. So, we have a very complex environment, very diverse environment, and we are way beyond the physical perimeters or the firewalls or the network perimeters. We have now we need to start thinking, how do we protect the, or how do we enforce, how we protect this gate? And it's not really easy to protect. So the question is, how can we implement adaptive enforcement? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to know yourself. You need to know your entities, user accounts, endpoints, accounts, privileges accounts. You need to know traffic, LDAP, NTLM, Kerberos. Second one is you need to know the enemy, the attacks. So MITRE attack is just one option. It definitely wants to know the enemy. And then the last one is now you can start with adaptive enforcement. And how do you do adaptive enforcement? Is you need to start identifying risks. Basically, you need to match. You need to create policies. Just like that. And you need to enforce the policies. How do you make possible policies visible? You involve the users. Based on risk, involve the policies, and based on tools. But you have to make them visible to the users because the identities are the ones that we're monitoring. Why won't we use the identities also for the enforcement? So, getting close to the end of the talk. Best practices for password theft prevention. Ensure passwords are unique. Use password revolt for high privilege accounts. Reset password policies. Jump servers for central monitoring. Monitor for authentication attack patterns in the network. Monitor for authentication attack patterns within your logs. Best practices for lateral movement detection. Don't enable local admin if you don't have to. Force password reset. Report on NTLM v1 usage and other old authentication protocols and unsafe. Patch all local privilege bugs. Set NTFS file permissions on PowerShell and exe. Users almost never need admin access. Make sure managers also. Enforce MFA on critical assets only, even within the network. So to summarize, passwords are still the weakest link. Lateral movement is attack's common denominator. Network analysis can find internal threats by looking at privileged users, sensitive endpoints, and anomalies. Adaptive response involves inline deployment, and when mobile and cloud rise, identity is the new perimeter. What I want you to end up today is clean up your Active Directory environment continuously. Be aware of Microsoft authentication design flows, move from detection only to adaptive enforcement, and from trust but verify to never trust and always verify. And one thing I want you to get out all the time, verify the user, validate the device, and limit access and privileges. Thanks, and have a great day.